Imagine a scene from the early 1600s. Two groups of leaders. You have English settlers on one side and native representatives on the other, and they meet in a clearing.
Right. Goods are changing hands.
Exactly. Goods change hands. Marks and signatures are pressed onto this piece of paper. Maybe a wampum belt is exchanged. There are speeches. Everybody shakes hands. And both sides walk away from this exact same table believing, like in absolute good faith, that they have just agreed to two completely mutually exclusive realities.
It really is the ultimate collision of legal universes. I mean, one side believes they've purchased the ground itself forever, and the other believes they have simply granted the use of that ground for a single season.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are looking at a profound, catastrophic collision of legal ideas, and to figure out how two groups of people could look at the exact same patch of dirt and see entirely different legal universes, we're blending together a few different sources today,
Yeah, we're looking at the environmental history detailed in William Cronon's Changes in the Land.
as well as the legal history mapped out in Stuart Banner's How the Indians Lost Their Land. And finally, the ultimate climax of this culture clash, which is the 1823 Supreme Court case, Johnson v. Amatosh.
And we really should establish the register for this exploration right away. I mean, this isn't some loud debate show. We are taking a quiet, precise, and unflinching look at how two totally incompatible ideas of what it means to own a place just collided.
Right.
We are examining a genuine conceptual gap. But the researchers we're relying on make a very specific argument that you, as the listener, really have to keep in mind here. While there was a real misunderstanding between two highly complex legal cultures, we cannot let the word misunderstanding do exculpatory work.
No, absolutely not. Because according to Stuart Banner's research, framing the dispossession of an entire continent as just a simple mix-up or like a tragic cultural blind spot, that would just launder the coercion. It launders the fraud and the force that actually drove it.
Yeah, it completely erases the violence of the legal machinery.
Exactly. The concept of property illuminates this history, but the historical consensus is clear that it does not excuse it. So we are going to look at the anatomy of that handshake, the physical landscape it took place on, and the legal machinery that weaponized the difference over the next 2 centuries.
Let's start with the paperwork on that table. When the English find that early 1600s deed, they were operating under a concept known as fee simple, or freehold.
Fee simple.
Right, and this is the absolute fullest form of ownership in the English legal system. It means your ownership of the land is permanent, it's exclusive, individual, and alienable.
So think about what happens when you buy a house today. You get a deed.
Yeah.
That concept of fee simple is exactly what the English brought with them. I mean, it means you can sell the property to anyone else whenever you want, and your rights extend from the dirt beneath your feet straight up into the sky.
Precisely. You aren't just buying the right to be there, you know. You are buying the soil, the trees, the water, and most importantly, the right to build a fence and banish everyone else from that spot until the end of time. And the documentary technology that powers this whole idea is the deed. A deed is a final, self-executing piece of paper. You sign it once, the transaction is complete, and you never have to speak to the seller again. The relationship is permanently over.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because to truly understand the gap, you have to look at what the other side of the table was thinking. Many native systems, particularly the coastal Algonquian peoples in New England that William Cronon studies, they didn't use fee simple at all.
No, they relied on a system of usufruct rights.
Right, usufruct. And Cronon is very clear about this. This wasn't a lack of property rights. I think there's this myth that they just wandered around a chaotic open commons. But it was a highly sophisticated, rigorously governed system of use rights.
Yeah, under a usufruct system, families or king groups held the right to the season's yield. So you had the right to plant a specific clearing with corn, or fish a specific salmon run, or hunt a specific territory during the winter.
And these rights were layered, right?
Completely layered and overlapping. I mean, one group might have the recognized right to farm a spot in the summer, and a completely different group might have the recognized right to hunt that exact same physical spot in the winter. The boundaries were defined by use, not by static fences.
To visualize this, just imagine agreeing to let a neighbor share the seasonal harvest of your community garden. You say, sure, you can pick tomatoes here this summer, and you shake on it. You establish a relationship of mutual benefit.
Right.
But then at the end of the summer, that neighbor produces a piece of paper claiming they now permanently own the soil, the airspace, and the right to banish you from the neighborhood forever.
It perfectly captures the mechanical scale of the disconnect. To the English, the transaction was literally sign here forever. To the native leaders, it was let's share this yield and let's keep talking.
Because their documentary technology was totally different, wasn't it?
Right. It wasn't a piece of paper that ended a transaction. It was the wampum belt.
Which isn't currency in the way we usually think of coins or money.
Exactly. That's a huge misconception. It's actually a mnemonic record of an ongoing relationship. When you exchange a wampum belt, it isn't a receipt for a final sale. The patterns woven into the belt record a covenant that has to be continually renewed. It has to be respoken and kept alive. If you don't maintain the relationship, the agreement fades.
So if these are both, highly complex, well-established legal grammars, how did they fail to translate? I mean, why didn't they eventually look around a few years later and realize they had been talking past each other?
Well, to answer that, we have to move from the paperwork to the dirt itself. The reason the English couldn't translate the native property system wasn't just linguistic, it was ecological. The sources point out that the colonists fundamentally misread the physical landscape.
So if Native Americans had these highly specific bounded use rights, why did the English look at Massachusetts and just see an empty wilderness?
Because of how native New Englanders managed their environment. As Cronon details, their management was incredibly active, but it was mobile.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, they moved their villages with the seasons so that they'd go from planting grounds in the spring to coastal fishing sites in the summer to inland hunting territories in the winter.
And they actively engineered the landscape, right?
Yeah.
Like, they didn't just passively forage for berries and whatever.
Far from it. They deliberately burned the forest underbrush twice a year. This cleared travel corridors, and it cultivated these edge habitats that would naturally draw game animals like deer. So it was a highly managed, curated ecosystem designed to maximize seasonal yields. But it lacked the visual markers the English expected.
Right, because the English arrive, and they have a very specific visual vocabulary for what owning land looks like.
Yeah.
To them, ownership is inextricably equated with improvement, and improvement means fences.
Always fences.
Fences, plows cutting deep, permanent furrows into the soil. It means permanent, enclosed structures that never move.
And if we connect this to the broader context of English political thought at the time, they operated under the belief that if land wasn't enclosed and actively farmed in the European style, it was legally vacant. They looked at a seasonally migrating village, or a forest that had been cleared by fire rather than an axe, and they quite literally could not process it as property. So they declared this land vacuum domicilium,
which is a Latin legal term meaning legally vacant dwelling, basically free for the taking.
Exactly.
Here's where it gets really interesting, though. Let me push back here. Was this doctrine of vacuum domicilium genuinely just a tragic cultural blind spot? I mean, were the Puritans really so locked into their idea of fences that they couldn't see an actively managed landscape? Or was this a convenient theology that allowed the colonists to look at an inhabited country and declare it entirely empty and available?
That is the crucial question, and the historical consensus heavily leans toward the latter.
Yeah.
Cronon and other historians suggest that while the conceptual gap started as a cultural lens through which they viewed the world, it very quickly calcified into a deliberate justification.
Right, an excuse.
Exactly. The very sophistication of the native system, its light, mobile, ecologically integrated footprint, that was aggressively misinterpreted as absence. Colonial leaders like John Winthrop explicitly argued that the native populations only had a natural right to the land, not a civil right, specifically because they hadn't subdued it with fences and permanent towns.
And this brings us to a major pivot in the timeline of our deep dive. The sources make a very specific argument here, and we need to stress this. This conceptual gap between fee simple and usufruct, it was entirely real, but it did not stay neutral. Over the next 2 centuries, that gap was weaponized.
This is where Stuart Banner's legal history becomes incredibly illuminating. Banner traces the arc of dispossession, and he points out that the history of how Native Americans lost their land is not a monolith. The strategy shifted over time, and it was entirely dependent on the balance of power.
So early on, like in the 1600s, when Native nations were militarily powerful and vastly outnumbered the colonists who were just clinging to the coast, Europeans largely had to negotiate, right?
Exactly. They had to purchase land even if the terms of those purchases were culturally fraught. Because they were weak, colonial courts often actually recognized native title. They even punished colonists who tried to settle without a treaty. They needed to maintain peaceful relations just to survive.
Wait, let me stop you there. If the English knew they had to negotiate early on when they were outnumbered, doesn't that imply they actually did recognize native land rights initially? How does Banner explain the shift from recognizing those rights to just completely erasing them?
The shift is entirely driven by demographics and leverage. I mean, over the next 2 centuries, the colonial population exploded. Simultaneously, native populations were devastated by European diseases and grueling wars of attrition.
Right.
So as the balance of power tipped entirely in favor of the settlers, the mechanism of acquiring land shifted. It moved from diplomatic negotiation to military conquest and ultimately to law. And understanding how this legal machinery operated is vital.
So how does that ordinary, respectable machinery work? Show me the mechanics of how a conceptual misunderstanding turns into a tool for expropriation.
Well, what's fascinating here is, according to Banner, the misunderstanding over what a deed meant wasn't a mistake anymore. It became a deliberate structural tool. Let's look at debt traps, for example.
Okay.
Colonial governments allowed trading posts to extend massive amounts of credit to native hunters for goods like iron tools, cloth, or muskets.
Okay, so a hunter takes on debt expecting to pay it off with the winter fur harvest.
Yes. But what happens if the winter hunting is poor? Or if the local beaver population has been overhunted? The debt comes due and the trading post demands payment. The native hunter doesn't have currency. And the only collateral the colonial courts will accept is land.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So a colonial judge orders a tract of land to be transferred to the trader just to settle a private commercial debt.
So it's not an army marching across a border. It's a debt collector and a local magistrate.
Exactly. It's perfectly legal under colonial law and completely devastating. Another mechanism was the strategic use of alcohol during negotiations, which was heavily documented. And then you have the issue of slippery translations.
Translators who were usually employed by the land buyers, right?
Precisely. A treaty might be translated verbally as a sharing agreement, like a usufruct arrangement, but the paper that was signed was a fee simple deed. And perhaps the most insidious legal tactic was finding absolutely anyone to sign.
What do you mean? Like someone who didn't actually own the land?
Exactly. In many native systems, land was communal. It was held by the nation or the clan and could only be alienated by consensus of the leadership, if at all. But land speculators would find a dissenting faction, or sometimes just a few individuals with no cultural or political authority whatsoever, get them to sign a piece of paper and then take that paper to a colonial court.
And the court just accepts it.
To a colonial judge, a signature on a deed was a signature on a deed. The legal system recognized the paper, ignored the cultural context, and enforced the eviction.
Banner's research argues that the legal system was basically used to legitimize what essentially amounted to expropriation. I mean, by controlling the legal framework of property, by deciding what counted as a valid title, who was allowed to sell, and whose ownership the courts would recognize, settlers could make the dispossession of a continent look like standard, boring administrative law.
It's chilling when you realize how bureaucratic it was.
It really is. The side with more time, more demographic weight, and the printing presses forced the other into a rigged legal machinery where the only language spoken was the language of fee simple. If you didn't have a piece of paper with a signature on it, your centuries-old right to exist in the place just legally vanished.
And that rigged machinery, operating locally for decades, it eventually required a supreme foundational text at the federal level to permanently legitimize it. Which brings us to the year 1823.
Right. How does this local legal machinery get locked into the legal DNA of the entire United States?
Through a Supreme Court case called Johnson v. Emmentosh, written by Chief Justice John Marshall. What is fascinating about this case is that on its surface, it didn't even involve Native Americans directly.
Really?
No, it was a dry, technical property dispute between two lines of white claimants fighting over the exact same tract of land in Illinois.
Okay, set the scene for this. Who are Johnson and Emmentosh?
Well, one of these white claimants, Johnson's side, had bought the land directly from the Piankashaw and Illinois nations decades earlier, before the American Revolution. The other claimant, Emmentosh, had bought the exact same tract of land much later, but directly from the United States federal government. So the Supreme Court had to decide whose deed is actually valid.
Okay, let's use an analogy to clarify how strange this is. It's like two people going to court fighting over a car they both claim to have bought. One person bought it directly from the guy who was driving it, and the other person bought it from a massive dealership that claimed jurisdiction over the whole town. And the judge has to decide who actually had the right to sell the car in the first place.
That is a very apt way to look at it. And Chief Justice Marshall rules that the original driver, the native nations, never had the legal right to sell it to an individual in the first place. In deciding this case, Marshall established what we now call the doctrine of discovery. He ruled that the act of European discovery gave the discovering nation and its successor, the United States, ultimate title to the land.
Just because they planted a flag.
Essentially, yes. The act of arriving and closing it for a Christian European monarch superseded thousands of years of prior habitation. Marshall legally stripped native nations of fee simple ownership. He ruled that they were reduced to a mere right of occupancy.
You're right, of occupancy. What does that actually mean in practice?
It means they could live on the land, they could hunt on it, but they did not own it in the eyes of American law. Because they only had a right of occupancy, they were legally stripped of the right to sell their land to anyone but the sovereign, meaning the federal government.
So what does this all mean? Marshall permanently freezes those two tenure worlds we've been talking about into a strict hierarchy. The colonial concept of fee simple is cemented at the very top. Native rights are subjugated beneath it as mere occupancy. And the sovereign U.S. government holds the ultimate power to extinguish that occupancy at will.
It is the moment the legal system officially translates the cultural gap into a permanent doctrine of supremacy. In Marshall's own words in the decision, discovery gave an exclusive right to extinguish the Indian title of occupancy, either by purchase or by conquest. The law formally stated that Native people did not truly own their home. The wampum belt was entirely legally erased, and the self-executing deed became the only truth the courts could see.
And this is an ancient history, which is a vital point to make. The doctrine of discovery, established in Johnson v. Armitage, is not just a relic of the 19th century. It remains cited in United States courts into the 21st century. It is still the underlying foundation of American property law when dealing with native land today.
It represents the complete triumph of one conceptual grammar over another, backed by the full force of the state.
Think about your own neighborhood. When you walk outside today and you look at a property deed, or you see a fence dividing a field, or you look up a line on a local zoning map, you are looking at the direct, living descendants of this very legal machinery. You are looking at a system that, according to our sources, codified a catastrophic dispossession entirely under the guise of administrative law.
And there is one final, unsettling thread to pull on, drawn from the debates among the scholars we read for this. The usufruct framework we spent time discussing today, those seasonal, layered use rights, perfectly describes the Algonquian peoples of New England that Cronon studied. But the blunt legal instrument of Johnson v. Armitage didn't care about regional nuance or ecological differences.
No, it applied to everyone, regardless of how they actually managed their land.
Exactly. Consider how this single, flat legal category of mere occupancy was used to legally erase hundreds of radically diverse native land systems across the entire continent.
Right, it didn't just apply to mobile seasonal villages.
No, it was applied to the highly engineered, permanent agricultural properties of the pueblos in the Southwest. It was applied to the complex, hereditary, strictly owned fishing rights of the Pacific Northwest. How much cultural genius, how many intricate, sustainable legal systems of environmental management were simply legally erased by the courts just because they didn't look exactly like an English fence?
It all circles back to that initial handshake we talked about at the beginning. One side thought they were opening a relationship, and the other thought they were closing a sale. And the side that viewed land as a permanent commodity spent the next 300 years building a massive legal empire to ensure their definition was the only one that survived. Like and subscribe. It really helps the channel reach others.